Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda DeMayo. And on behalf of Darien Library, I want to welcome you to this afternoon's program, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Government in Thought and Action. We're very lucky to be joined by Mark Nunan, who will be sharing his knowledge with us. Mark Nunan holds a PhD from Stanford University. Prior to his retirement in 2018, he worked as an executive in Palo Alto, Manhattan, and Paris, providing domestic and international business development services to corporate and government clients. He moved to Darien in the year 2000, and for the past 18 months, he's been residing in the alpine land of Slovenia. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. If you have any questions today, please look for the Q&A or chat feature and type your questions in there. And at the end of the presentation, Mark and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoy the presentation. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Amanda, for that great introduction, and thank you to all who are joining us. I appreciate your attendance. Today, we're going to talk about, as Amanda said, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. We all know he was a New York politician. We're going to talk about his government in thought and action, because as we will see, he was active in both. He defied categorization. He was both a serious thinker and writer about governmental and societal issues, really along the lines of somebody like James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. He authored or co-authored 19 books, ranging from domestic issues and domestic policy to international law. He wrote thousands of articles, speeches, essays, memos, and letters. He is probably, they say, the largest single collection at the Library of Congress with over 1 million pieces. But interestingly, having written so much, he was also a man of action. He typically started with a left-leaning or progressive set of goals, but he revised them based on data, as we'll be talking about in a minute. And this often led him to pursue conservative means. Interestingly, you can see that in who he worked under. He worked under 2 Democrat presidents and 2 Republican presidents, 4 in a row. He was respected by each of them and listened to by them. And I was just looking at this afternoon and wondering, can we think of anyone in government like this today in our more polarized time? To understand him, I want to first look at the foundation of the progressive movement, because he came out of that progressive tradition. And who is one of the key founders of that movement? It's Woodrow Wilson. And one very interesting thing he said, I found fascinating, is the rhetorical introduction of the Declaration of Independence is the least part of it. If you want to understand the real declaration, do not repeat the preface. This was a speech he made 1 year before he was elected to the presidency. Very interesting thing for a future president to say. Earlier in his career, he said socialism and democracy are almost one and the same. Both rest upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. This is from his book, Socialism and Democracy. That's an interesting concept for a future president. Here are the declaration throwaway lines, or some of them from that preface. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So the individual is certainly more important in the Declaration than just the state. Wilson felt that the state and the community could essentially manage the lives of individuals more effectively than individuals themselves sometimes. Looking at Lincoln on this same subject, we might ask, who is right, Lincoln or Wilson? This is from a letter Lincoln wrote 1 year before he was elected president. All honor to Jefferson, to introduce into a merely revolutionary document, and here he's talking again about the Declaration of Independence, to introduce an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. And those are those words that we just saw, that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. Lincoln saw the preface to the Declaration as essential, essentially, to the success of his government and to the future of the United States, and in fact, of all men in all times. He had a big vision for the future. What about Moynihan? Well, we might say both sides now. As he put it, the central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, which determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. And here he's thinking about New Deal liberalism, for example, and that sign and that picture says it well, keep to the left. He styled himself a New Deal Democrat, but he could be very culturally conservative. And as he grew in politics, he adopted more conservative means, as we will see. Was he liberal? Was he conservative? Well, he said, I'm a Democrat. And there are an important group of things only the government can do. These are obviously things like national security, property rights protection, the rule of law, but also for the New Dealers, helping the less advantaged, the less fortunate, the immigrant communities, etc. But his second corollary of that is, let us be clear that for most of the world, what they most need is less government. This is essentially that Jeffersonian ideal, government governs best, which governs least. Clairvoyant, he seemed to be clairvoyant. Throughout much of his career, he pointed to trends in advance of their appearance to the general public and warned us about their possible dangers and the fact that government could do something about them. Well, he wasn't really clairvoyant. He didn't have a crystal ball. What he had was solid data. And this came out of his philosophy, essentially, of governing. The crucial stage in solving a problem in government is that point where one defines what kind of problem it is. So first you need to define it, just like you need to do in a business. You need to define a market, define the product, etc., before you develop solutions for it. He often quoted Georges Bernanos, the French writer, the worst, the most corrupting of lies are problems poorly stated that obfuscates the truth. You are entitled to your own opinion. You are not entitled to your own facts. This is one of his most famous quotes. He originally wrote it in an article in the 1980s in the American Spectator, and he used it to great effect in a primary debate in the 1990s in one of his Senate runs. Here's an example, one of the early examples of this fact-based decision-making. Calling all cars. Remember that show? He called all cars a public health emergency. He wrote an article, Epidemic on the Highways, in 1959. He was working for Governor Averell Harriman of New York, and he chaired his traffic safety committee. And he called in this article, Vehicle Deaths, a public health epidemic. This was based on actual data from accidents and traffic deaths, which were compiled at Cornell University. At that time, there had been something like 1.4 million automobile deaths and something like 5 million injuries. And we've just been through a period of COVID where 1 million people died, and we call that a pandemic. It was a novel idea to call automobile deaths an epidemic. And he took this not just from Cornell, but for some leading doctors who were beginning to question the safety of vehicles, because the previous strategy had been to blame the driver as a poor driver, as distracted, whatever. But in fact, he was saying, maybe it's the vehicles that have a problem, not just the driver. And he started reading these articles by a guy named Ralph Nader, who is a recent graduate of the university. And he liked what his work was. So he asked him in a letter, would you be interested in coming to Washington to work on this subject? Moynihan was now Assistant Secretary of Labor to Arthur Goldberg in the Johnson administration, or the Kennedy first and then Johnson. Nader worked under him for the next 2 years and published his famous bestseller, Unsafe at Any Speed, in 1965, which completely revolutionized Americans' concept of vehicle safety. This led to LBJ signing the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act in '66. So you see the time length it took, 7 years from Moynihan's initial article to that bill to become law. And here's another one, fact-based research on ethnic groups in New York City. He went against the grain. He said ethnicity matters still, even more so than it has in the past, and it will again in America's future. As he said, the notion that the intense and unprecedented mixture of ethnic and religious groups in American life was soon to blend into a homogeneous end product has outlived its usefulness and also its credibility. The point about the melting pot is that it did not happen. In his theory, he and Nathan Glaser, who was a professor at Harvard, wrote this together. He did the part on the Irish, Glaser did the other parts. And it was partially a way to debunk Marxism, because Marxism felt class trumps everything. And class, the proletariat will take over, etc. Glaser and Moynihan said, no, ethnicity and religion trump class. And in fact, they will become the leading political issues in the next decades. And I think from what we've seen in the last 20 years or so, he hit the nail on the head. Another area where he came up with very surprising conclusions. He wrote a report for Johnson. It ended up being called the Moynihan Report about inner city poverty. And what they expected to find was lack of economic opportunity. But what they actually found was that most of the poorest were broken families, where young men, as he put it, from the wild Irish slums of the 19th century Eastern Seaboard to the riot-torn suburbs of Los Angeles, there is one unmistakable lesson: a community that allows a large number of young men to grow up in broken families dominated by women. This is no offense to women. It's just a fact that he found, never acquiring any stable relationship to male authority, never acquiring any set of rational expectations about the future. That community asks for and gets chaos. This was a private memo to Johnson. It was leaked to the public, and it nearly destroyed his life, as we will see. But one thing that he really deeply believed, because of what he had studied, is that family structure may now be the principal component of class structure. And he also took this from his own childhood. His father abandoned his mother and 3 children. Pat was the oldest, his brother Mike, and a younger sister, when Pat was 10 years old. So they literally went from an upwardly mobile middle-class community in suburban New Jersey and Long Island to an inner city poor kid with a single mother trying to scrape by. And he took jobs himself as a shoeshine boy in Penn Station, as a newspaper hawker. His goal was to make $1 a day so he could help support the family. And he did that for many years as a child. So he understood these communities because he lived in them himself. How did the Moynihan Report affect LBJ's civil rights policy? Well, as I said, the report analyzed and proposed solutions to, first, the historical effects of slavery. That's where the broken family started. Also, economic and educational deprivation in the ex-slave communities, and racism, particularly in the Deep South. Welfare law, which was driving an increase in fatherless children. The Aid for Dependent Children program, which dated from the Social Security bill, provided funds to women who did not have a father in the house. So you get what you pay for, and more women were having children without fathers living in the house without marriage. And he believed this created an inner city tangle of pathologies. This was a time of all the civil rights riots and a lot of difficulties in the 60s. Many condemned him for this when it leaked. A few defended him, including Martin Luther King and Kenneth Clark, who was one of the premier Black scholars of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This is where the term blaming the victim come from. It was coined by a professor at Boston University. It targeted Moynihan. He was called a racist by Dr. Benjamin Franklin Peyton, the National Council of Churches, who later became the president of Tuskegee Institute, and also had the courage to apologize to Moynihan later. He was called a prophetic document by another Black scholar, Dr. William Julius Wilson, and several others. So it wasn't all one-sided, but it definitely put him in the doghouse with the far left of the Democrat Party and with the established welfare leaders. He also wrote Johnson's Howard University speech, which was given in June of '65. It called for equality of result, not just equality of opportunity. And this really guided LBJ's further civil rights policy actions and led into things like quotas and so forth. As we will see, this great society and its new progressivism, Moynihan began to see that the road to hell can indeed be paved with good intentions. And what he saw was great society programs tax and take money from the poor themselves and from the middle class and give it to an increasingly growing middle-class set of community organizers, social workers, and government bureaucrats to manage problems at the micro level. And he really began to realize this was an impossible task for bureaucrats to fan out through cities and try to manage family problems and so forth. He wrote a book about this later in 1969 called Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding: Community Action in the War on Poverty. He saw the community action essentially fostering negative attacks on the United States and historically some of the things that had happened, while in not necessarily helping the poor people that he wanted to help. So after this, he promoted legislation that would hopefully bypass Washington, D.C. whenever possible. And the kingpin of this was a thing called the Family Assistance Plan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And it was based on an income or program strategy instead of a services strategy. So instead of having, thousands of bureaucrats providing services, he thought it's much more logical to provide income directly to the poorest families above the poverty, below the poverty line or near there. He was very prescient in his concern about the growth of these government agencies. Today, 7 of the top 10 highest income counties are now in the Washington, D.C. area: Virginia, Maryland, D.C. When his career started, only 1 of those counties made the top 10. The rest of them were places where people manufactured things like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, or the finance industry in New York. But that all changed with the growth of these government programs and with all the lobbying that went with it. There's a theological underpinning to all of this, which goes back to Thomas Aquinas, but you can see it in people like Eisenhower. Aquinas studied natural law, and in his political philosophy, he said the ideal state allows the smallest decision units closest to a problem to handle it. So the parents of a family, the town, the region, the state, subsidiary institutions should be first because they're closest to the issue. The central government should be last because they do not understand necessarily the issue of a small town. This was followed up by a couple of encyclicals in the 19th and 20th century. Man precedes the state and possesses, prior to the formation of any state, the right of providing for the substance of his body. And this, could even be Lincoln saying something like this. Lincoln said, labor precedes capital, because without labor, you do not have any capital. So the individual, again, that part of the Declaration of Independence, dealing with the individual as the primary institution, not the central government. One should not withdraw from individuals and commit to the community what they can accomplish by their own enterprise. This is the principle of subsidiary function. This is the 40th anniversary of the first encyclical. It's very interesting to see these papal documents really echoing some of our great documents about democracy. And as Eisenhower said it so clearly, the administration follows two simple rules. First, the federal government should perform an essential task only when it cannot be otherwise adequately performed. And second, in performing that task, our government must not impair the self-respect, the freedom, and the incentive of the individual. Government can fully meet its obligations without creating a dependent population or a domineering bureaucracy. One of the things that Moynihan began to be very concerned about, he said the problem with these huge bureaucracies is that the people who distribute the services to the poor tend to be corrupted in some way, not because they're bad people, but because of the nature of the bureaucracy itself, while the poor tend to be demeaned and diminished and feel lessened by receiving the money or the funds or the services, but they also have to play a cat and mouse game with the social workers and so forth. So he really began to pull away from that idea of big government services. However, the crux of the issue, when you have subsidiarity and civil rights, how do you go about dealing with the economic factors in chronic poverty? We mentioned earlier the FAP, the Nixon-Moynihan Family Assistance Plan. Moynihan, having worked for both Kennedy and Johnson, essentially wrote himself into Nixon's presidency. He had developed a reputation as a clear thinker about government problems. And he started sending these letters to Nixon about what he called the Family Assistance Plan, which would abolish poverty for dependent children and working poor. As a professor, he was now a professor at Harvard. He invited Nixon to speak at Harvard when he was a 68 candidate, and it was a huge success. He then was named President Nixon's White House Urban Affairs advisor and later counselor to the president for urban affairs. The Family Assistance Plan, as Moynihan and Nixon designed it, was really subsidiarity in action. It was based on class, really, income levels, not race. They both felt that this was a program which would address poverty across any particular ethnic group or racial group, because it was based on providing a direct funds to people under the poverty line or a certain amount above the poverty line, depending on how many children. It was a negative income tax model, very similar to what we saw during COVID. It allows the family to make its own decisions rather than to be directed by government bureaucrats. And surprisingly, this was a pretty popular idea in the 60s. 68% in 64 backed it and 73% in 69. He wrote later, after the process of going through this, The Politics of a Guaranteed Income, the Nixon administration, the Family Assistance Plan. It was published in 73. This did not go through, and we'll talk a little bit about why that happened. But he was always encouraging Nixon with this quote: "It is Tory men with liberal principles who have enlarged a democracy." Now, what did he mean by that? Why Tory men and what liberal principles? Well, he wanted Nixon to model himself on Benjamin Disraeli, who was the leading 19th century UK Tory prime minister, the leading conservative of his day. But he passed legislation considered quite liberal for that time. He extended the voting franchise by an enormous amount in the Reform Act of '67. He pushed through legislation financing affordable housing for workers. He pushed through healthcare reform, labor protections, protections for strikers, and other things that most conservatives felt were anathema. And as one of his opponents had to admit on the liberal side, the Conservative Party had done more for the working classes in 5 years than the liberals have in 50. Moynihan spent quite a bit of time in London in his youth, and he came to admire Disraeli. And he pushed Nixon to become the US conservative leader who would do more to alleviate poverty than any liberal since FDR. So what happened? What happened to the fat Pat? Well, liberal Democrats don't want you to win, and the welfare lobby doesn't want to change. And what really did happen? Actually, it was very successful in both the House and the Senate. It passed through both in slightly different versions. And it so happens when there are slightly different versions, it goes into a conference between both houses. And there it died. And from what I've read in the history books, most of the blame before its death goes to a few left-wing senators, although there were many conservatives against it too. But it had enough backing to pass both houses. So it's very interesting to think what might have happened, because this would have done away with all the previous welfare programs and replaced it with this. We don't know how that would have worked, but it certainly was a revolutionary change. He left the administration a little bit later. Nixon had then called him back to be the ambassador to India, where he was quite successful. He negotiated a debt relief deal. India was a very poor country. They had been borrowing money from us to pay for food imports so they could feed their people. So there was this huge imbalance of payments. He got that corrected, and he signed a $2.2 billion check to the Indian government, which made the Guinness Book of Records as the largest check ever written at that time. Ford named him UN ambassador. Moynihan saw the UN as equivalent to a parliamentary organization in which the US was essentially the leader of the minority. Remember, you had the non-aligned states, you had the communist states, and most of those were not in our court. So we were in opposition, and he acted accordingly. He basically said, no more pushing the US around. And he first said this in an article, The United States in Opposition, down there on the lower left. And that's when Ford really realized this is the guy I need at the UN. And as he said, am I embarrassed to speak for a less than perfect democracy? Not one bit. Find me a better one. Do I suppose there are societies which are free of sin? No, I don't. Do I think ours is, on balance, incomparably the most hopeful set of human relations the world has? Yes, I do. And he really believed that, and he thought that way in the UN. He called out countries which attacked the US for some failure or another to address their own failures, which in many cases were far worse than ours. Here I want to stop for a minute and just do a quick summary of his life, his public life from 1944 to 74. He was a naval officer in his youth. He became policy counselor to 4 presidents, a diplomat, and a professor. He was very well educated, and that was basically through the GI Bill and through ROTC. He got a Bachelor of Naval Sciences in '46. That was through signing up for the ROTC, and a Bachelor in History in 1948, both from Tufts. He got a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy the year following. He became a Fulbright Fellow at the London School of Economics for 1 year, but he stayed in London for 3 years. And there he was exposed to both conservative and liberal ideas. He took lectures from some of the famous conservative professors as well as liberal thinkers of the era. And he got a PhD from Tufts in 1961. So he was in active duty in the Navy for part of his academics, and finally as a junior officer for about a year on a ship. In the mid-50s, he became an assistant and ghostwriter to New York Governor Harriman. He was quite close to him. He became his director of government departmental reports. So he was making reports on all the different departments in New York State. And he learned a lot from doing that helped him in those later documents we discussed. From 61 through 76 at various periods, he's the only man in US history to serve in the cabinet or sub-cabinet of 4 consecutive presidents of 2 different parties: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. And he admired all of them in different ways. He warned Johnson not to pursue so aggressively the Vietnam War. He warned Nixon to watch out for the people around him because they were not always serving him well. Unfortunately, neither of those guys listened to him attentively in that case, or perhaps they did and they just couldn't do anything about it. He had academic jobs on and off during this period when he was out of government, first at Wesleyan in Connecticut, Syracuse in upstate New York, and finally Harvard, where in 66 he was named a full professor and director of a new institute, the Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies. And that's where he was able to invite Nixon to speak in 1968. So I separate these things because those previous appointments are all appointed jobs. And then he went into the electoral arena and was extremely successful. I mean, he was a senator from 77 until January of 2001, when his final term ended. He sponsored or co-sponsored 54 bills that became law. And if you do the math, over 24 years, that's about 2.25 per year, which is about 1 every 5 months. That's pretty hard to do. Many bills take years and years to get through Congress. He sponsored or co-sponsored over 1,000 bills and resolutions in total. Now, resolutions can be very picayune little things like naming a building after a local politician or a judge or something, to more important things. He was very prescient in his political antenna. He predicted the Soviet collapse within the 1980s, first in a 79 article in Newsweek, then in a Senate speech in 1980. And throughout the 80s, he criticized the military buildup of Reagan because he felt that the Soviets would just collapse on their own, that the intelligence community overstated their strength and their economic prowess. He felt their economy could not stand up on its own much longer. He was right, obviously. Obviously, many people think that Reagan's buildup created part of that need for them to collapse, but both men were right in some way. After the Soviet collapse, he did not recommend NATO expanding into Eastern Europe. He said it was the worst mistake we have made, that it would cause military conflict eventually in the future. And he based that on the work of George Kennan, who was the dean of Soviet diplomacy for the United States since World War II, and who had come out and said NATO should not go east. It will cause untold havoc eventually. So obviously there's 2 sides of this debate, and today we have the Ukraine war. He was involved in many key issues of the 80s and 90s. With Bob Dole, he was one of the managers of the Social Security reform in 83. He was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee in the early 90s, chairman of the Senate Committee of Environment and Public Works, which was very dear to his heart, vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee in the 1980s during the Reagan era. One of his most important pieces of legislation is called ICE-T, Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. And what this essentially did was enabled new spending for mass transit and urban needs. Most of the funding for transportation had been spent on highways since the Eisenhower era. It also mandated automobile airbags. But because he was a masterful politician, he was able to gain the support of the highway lobby, plus the Western, Midwestern, and Southern states, by allowing them to continue to spend all of their funds on highways, but allowing urban areas like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles to spend some of their funding on mass transit, which, as you can see from the picture, is a problem in New York and many other large cities. The FHA, the Federal Highway Administration, called this a watershed in U.S. transportation policy. And indeed, it did change the thinking of many in government and in engineering and so forth about what is required to make a large city livable. In the Reagan era, he was largely in opposition, both on his defense buildup. He felt the Iran-Contra scandal was an abandonment of America's principles of international law. He was against the fiscal policies, disputed David Stockman's budget. Interestingly, Stockman and he had a history. When Stockman was a student at Harvard, he had lived in Moynihan's house. They used to rent a room in the attic to students, and Stockman was, as they called Dave, the babysitter. But now he was all grown up, brilliant guy, and very successfully managing Reagan's budgetary numbers. He voted no on Bush 41, and Clinton NAFTA. It was negotiated over two different presidents. He feared it would harm U.S. workers' jobs and incomes. I think obviously that's been proven right. He thought it would hurt the environment and many other things, but he just didn't think it was a good idea. The Clinton healthcare plan, he passed out of the committee that he was on, but he felt it was a very secretive process. It was a coercive type of legislation that could not pass through the Congress. He tried to encourage Clinton to modify it, but that didn't happen. And he called Clinton welfare reform in one of his quips, boob bait for bubbas. He was most concerned, as with the family assistance plan, that cutting welfare would harm children, the most vulnerable people in our society. But by forcing their parent or parents to work. Now, actually, later on, it was proved that this was a pretty successful strategy. And to his credit, he admitted, he said, the data now show me that I was wrong and that they were right. He was very willing to reverse positions if the data showed him that that was necessary. Federal architecture was a huge passion for him, lifelong. He started working on this in 1962 when he wrote a memo to Kennedy called The Guiding Principles for Federal Architecture, and later the redevelopment of Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue had gotten a little bit old and fusty, and he wanted to see grand architecture, going back to the idea of Jefferson and the original founding of Washington, that architecture reflects the government and the people of the country, federal architecture. This led to passage of the bill he sponsored, Federal Triangle Development Act in 1987. This was a huge project. That triangle there on the top picture is where that triangle is. And that building in the front of it is larger here on the lower left. It's the Reagan office building. It's ironic that he spent so much time debating Reagan on the merits of his policies, and in the end passed the bill that allowed the government to build this huge monument to Reagan. I didn't realize this, but it's the second largest office building for federal workers outside of the Pentagon. So it's a big, big space. He sponsored or supported actively many of the major architectural and construction projects for New York and Washington. Pennsylvania Avenue in New York, in Washington, and Union Station, the renovation there. The New York City Federal Courthouse, which is now called the Moynihan Federal Courthouse. Penn Station, which has a Moynihan train hall. All these were named after him later in recognition of the things that he did. He also got Governor's Island returned to New York for $1 by negotiating with Bill Clinton. And one thing that he did that you don't see on that slide is he prevented destruction of landmark buildings such as Grand Central Station. That was set to be destroyed like Penn Station was. and the New York Customs House down in Lower Manhattan in the Battery, which today is the Museum of the Native Americans, but it's a beautiful old classic building. And he felt it was a travesty to tear these things down and put up new, more bland architecture. Moving away from architecture into international law, he returns to his theme of ethnicity in a book called Pandemonium, Ethnicity in International Politics. And as he said, there are today just 8 states on Earth which both existed in 1914 and have not had their form of government changed by violence since then. Far the most frequent factor involved has been ethnic conflict. And if you look at it, it's true. The 8 states are the United States, the UK, Switzerland, Sweden, and 4 of the English Commonwealth countries. All other countries in the world that existed then and exist now have had violence change their society. The first book there on the Law of Nations is a group of essays on American government relationship to international law. He was very concerned that that was breaking down, that on the outside, all these ethnic tensions were causing disruption. He particularly saw that with the Soviet Union. So he was very concerned that the world not go down a path of tribalism. Some recent examples that he referred to, and which are very prescient, really, the Soviet Union came apart along ethnic lines. The most important factor in this breakup was the disinclination of Slavic Ukraine to continue under a regime dominated by Slavic Russia. And, you know, that was written in the early 90s, and here we are today with a war in that very same area. Yugoslavia came apart also, beginning with the brutal clash between Serbia and Croatia. Here again, nations with only the smallest differences in genealogy, with indeed practically a common language. Ethnic conflict does not require great differences. Small will do. Fortunately, in Yugoslavia, these countries are for the most part peaceful with each other. There are a couple of tinder points, but so far so good. He was very concerned about secrecy in government from his experience as an ambassador, but also on the Intelligence Committee. He began to conclude that so much secrecy serves only to protect not national security, but the careers and reputations of civil servants and politicians. This is a memo or an essay he wrote after they did a investigation on his committee on the security agencies, essentially. He argued that secrecy had become a form of federal regulation. He even proposed a bill to abolish the CIA. It didn't go anywhere, but he gave a number of examples of this. Vanilla files are, there were investigations by the security agencies in the 40s and 50s of communist infiltration in the US government. And they essentially validated many of the charges of some people, but the security agencies never told either FDR or Truman about these. So they had no way of stopping the growth of McCarthyism and all those things, which he felt could have been dissipated if these files had actually been made public. The Bay of Pigs, the intelligence community was notoriously wrong. Iran-Contra, they got themselves in a complete mess. And of course, where he was calling for the likely collapse of the Soviet Union, the US intelligence community was actually saying, oh no, they're growing, their economy is nearly as big as ours, etc. He saw this as complete hogwash. He traced this obsession with secrecy to Woodrow Wilson's Espionage Act, which you've read any history of that time, you know, was used to jail and silence his political opponents. As Moynihan put it, the modern age began. 3 new institutions that entered American life: conspiracy, loyalty, secrecy. Each had become institutional. Bureaucracies were established to attend each. Departments and agencies hoard information, and the government becomes a kind of market. Today, there are 4.3 million people with security clearances. And studies show there's a monetary angle to this also. People with security clearances are paid better, both in government and in the private sector. So it's a very useful thing to have. And if you're part of that club, you don't want to be out of it and you want it to grow. He was very concerned about these kind of things. Another area he commented on is defining deviancy down. This is one of his famous terms. We're getting used to a lot of behavior that is not good for us. We saw his concerns about ethnicity and tribalism. Well, he has three categories of those defining deviancy down: altruistic. And he gave an example of this, the mass release of mental patients in the 1960s. They would just open the doors, promising that they would have neighborhood clinics that would treat these people. It was a utopian ideal. They never built the clinics. Many of those people are still living on the streets in big cities all over America. The second was normalizing. You redefine something as normal. For example, he talked about single parenthood in the Moynihan Report. Well, it's just another lifestyle choice. Children won't feel so bad if you don't, single it out. He was saying, look, all of their studies, and he wasn't just his, there were several others after this that showed that children in inner cities in poor surroundings have a very difficult time, and they're going to feel bad whether you normalize that or not. Opportunistic, as he put it, there's good money to be made out of bad schools. He might say the same thing. There's good money to be made out of security. There's good money to be made out of anything in government. And he didn't think that was a very good idea. Charles Krauthammer, after seeing this, wrote his article, defining deviancy up. It is not enough for the deviant to be normalized. The normal must be found to be deviant. And I think, this was all written 30 years ago, but how true it has become. One thing he was concerned about, obviously, then, was integrity in government. As he said, no one is innocent after the experience of governing. In other words, it's a difficult thing where you see a lot of bad behavior, but also not everyone is guilty. And I just picked a few that I admire, and I think he certainly would have admired. George Washington. I think if more students and people read his farewell address, particularly about his comments on virtue and the requirements of a moral society for the survival of a republic. Eisenhower, we saw the comment earlier, that government which should do what it must do, but must not do too much to demean the people. Lincoln and his fast clinging to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And good old Harry Truman, you can't get rich in politics unless you're a crook. And he was offered a lot of money after he was president to endorse products, to go on speaking tours, all these things. He refused every one of them, even though he was not a wealthy man, because he said it would demean the office of president. And we're a long way from that today. The lower folks there, on the left is Victor Berger, who was singled out by Woodrow Wilson for a complete campaign of persecution. They gave him a 10-year jail sentence. He was a leading publisher in the Midwest, and he did not agree with Wilson going to war. And he stated it in his editorials. So they prosecuted him under the Espionage Act. He got 10 years in jail. He was elected to Congress, and they wouldn't seat him. They said, we'll hold a special election. The special election, he won by even a bigger margin. They still wouldn't seat him. Finally, after the war, he was pardoned, or his conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court, and he was seated in Congress. Next to him is Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father. He was an 4-term congressman. He went in at one salary, and when they raised the salary, he refused to take the extra money. He would bring it back to the disbursement office because he said, I was elected for one pay grade and I don't deserve any more. Sam Rayburn started his career under Wilson. He was in Congress. He ended it. He dropped dead in office in the early 60s under Kennedy. He never took a dime. He had $35,000 in his bank account when he died. And when he first started Congress, his law partners sent him a check from one of their clients because it was his share. He sent it back because he said, I cannot take any money from any company that I might have to pass a legislation about. Fiorello LaGuardia was a completely upright man, completely routed the corruption in New York for the period that he was mayor. And I think Moynihan was a decent and a truly honest guy. All of these people were wonderful public servants, and we certainly need more of them today and in the future. So my paradoxical conclusions about Moynihan: he had liberal goals, but he learned he must adopt conservative means if he was going to succeed. Only government can address certain problems, just like Eisenhower, just like Lincoln. But that government which governs best governs least, just like Jefferson. And then in his books on international law and on domestic law, the rule of law, whether domestic and international, is a must for our democratic republic to survive. And the rule of law flounders when extremist shibboleths reign. Culture, as he put it, that conservative culture, must recover it. Politics, which he saw as liberal, must protect and extend it. I think he was a unique individual, certainly one of our more unique politicians in my lifetime. I lived in New York City for much of the time he was senator, and he did a lot for New York. There's no doubt about it. So finally, a little bibliography. If you'd like to get this, we'll send it out to you. A couple of these books are in local libraries. You've got A Portrait in Letters. That's a wonderful book. It's just a series of letters between him and other people that he was working with, including Johnson, Nixon, etc. It's at the Greenwich Library, and you have The Law of Nations at the Darien Library. But all of these books are quite interesting. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. So
Glad you enjoyed it.
I have a question for you. If he was still alive today and in the government, what contributions do you think he would make?
I think he would try to lessen the divide between the extreme left and the extreme right. I think he would try to encourage the Republicans to be more Republican in a way, and the Democrats to be more centrist, because in the end, he was a New Deal Democrat, but he realized that the New Deal mechanisms for dealing with social problems had kind of outlived their usefulness, and that they needed to find a new way to reform those programs. So I think that would be important. I think he'd be very knowledgeable about what's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And he was in Ljubljana in 1963, of all places, at some kind of an international conference, and he said he loved it.
What do you think he would his stance be on our current gun law situation?
I don't know, honestly. I suspect he would want more controls on who purchases guns. And I think he saw mental health issues as critical. You know, when he talked about defining deviancy down, and he admitted that he was part of the administration that did that. In the Kennedy administration, they decided to allow people out of mental hospitals because many of them had been institutionalized against their will, etc. And they promised there would be clinics to treat them, but there weren't. So he had a lot of concern about the whole issue of mental health and how these people living on the streets, which has metastasized really in our time. So I think he would definitely be very concerned about it.
Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? Don't speak up at once or type at once.
Please ask away. One of the things I would say, he was very fortunate in his family. Even though his childhood was broken, he had a grandfather on his mother's side who lived in Bluffton, Indiana, which is one of these picture-perfect Middle Western towns on the Wabash River. And he and his brother used to go there for the summers. So their grandfather became the surrogate father. And he wrote about that and how important it was to him, growing up as a young man. And the second thing, he met his wife when he was working for Averill Harriman, Liz Brennan, and they were just two of the most compatible people. He was so fortunate. She ran all of his campaigns. They barely spent any money on these campaigns, $18 million in 8 campaigns. Can you imagine that? He wrote his own advertising. She went out and did all the campaign work. They were a real team.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Okay, one of the questions, we've got some. Just a thanks for giving your talk. Would he have voted for the large spending bills passed the last 2 years? What do you think?
I think he would have, probably. I don't think he would have liked everything in there, but this bill is supposed to be reconstructing transportation and so forth. I think he was always concerned about the infrastructure of the country. So I think that one for sure he would have passed. I don't know about the other, but he was a liberal Democrat. Let's face it. I mean, and he knew Joe Biden. He would have been a friend of Joe Biden's in the Senate with him.
That's it for questions.
Okay. Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you and to everyone.
Thank you.
If you feel interested to read more by Moynihan, I would suggest the book of letters that he wrote. It's edited by someone, and it has his letters and also letters to him from interesting people. And you see the kind of character he has when he's talking to these people. He tells them the truth pretty much. He tells it as he sees it, which is pretty rare.
That's wonderful that they were able to get the letters and compile it into a book.
Yeah, well, he gave a lot of his papers to the Library of Congress, and when he died, his family gave the rest of them. He used to write every day, literally every day, and they had a house in upstate New York with a little abandoned schoolhouse up the road from it, and he took over the schoolhouse as his study, and every summer he would go up there and write, like from 8 in till lunch, and then go back and write some more. And so all these
the schoolhouse still exists.
Yeah. It's called Pindar's Corner.
Okay.
Pindar, like the Latin poet or writer. So very interesting guy, a very varied career, obviously. And I think he was a great American.
Yeah, you've proved that today with this talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we'll get Mark back here in the next couple of months to do another talk with us. Thank you so much.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.